Okay. So we continue our conversation about stomach, and our next topic is to talk about main hormones, and here they are. My squares kind of shifted upwards, but I'll make sense out of it. So the hormone that is perhaps the one that will deserve most of our attention is called gastrin. Okay. So it's produced by G cells, a type of endocrine cells that respond to the presence of chemicals, peptides and amino acids in the stomach. Now let me ask you this. When we say presence of peptides and amino acids in the stomach, what do we refer to essentially? Food. There's food in the stomach, gastrin is going to be produced. Okay? And gastrin has widespread effects across the entire digestive system. First, it increases the secretory activity of gastric glands. When we say increases secretory activity, how does it affect digestion? Increases digestion, yes, that's it. And that makes perfect sense. Food, presence of food in the stomach is essentially a fluctuation away from homeostasis. Does that make sense? How can we bring it back to homeostasis? Destroy the food. Digest it. Food stimulates gastrin. Gastrin stimulates digestive secretions. Digestive secretions digest the food. Effects on small intestine. I'm going to grab this. Yeah, kind of. Well, yeah, I mentioned. So that's small intestine right here. Okay. Come here, buddy. It's viscera falling apart, but okay. So yeah, stomach is gone. I don't know where stomach is, but somewhere. So stomach was supposed to be here. Okay, right here. Well, that palm is now. Okay, and this is the start of a small intestine right here, and it goes all the way here. So it's going to be duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and essentially what gastrin does to small intestine, it increases the muscle activity, activates the propulsion. Now, when propulsion is going on, where does food go? Towards which orifice? Down to the anus, right? Moves to the anus, essentially freeing up the space in the small intestine for the food that is now where? In the stomach, right? So food via gastrin sends the signal to the small intestine, free up the space, I'm coming. Okay? From small intestine, food will eventually enter the large intestine via the valve right here that is called ileocecal valve. I don't know if you can. It's not far from ideal, but that's ileocecal valve. So gastrin relaxes that valve so that food, well, it's not a food anymore, but semi-digested product can move from the small intestine into the large one. Does that make sense? Now, in the large intestine, you may have practically digested, everything is gone, it's almost feces. But you need to free space in the large intestine as well. Does that make sense? So that produces, and large intestine activity will be stimulated too. That specific activity of the large intestine is called mass movements. Does that make sense? Now, mass movements is a powerful contraction of smooth muscle in the large intestine that leads to defecation. It's not defecation yet, but the content of large intestine comes through the sigmoid colon into the rectum, and it's ready to be defecated. Does that make sense? So essentially, gastrin, if the food is present in the stomach, gastrin, 1, increases the digestive activity of the stomach itself, and 2, increases the propulsion in the intestine as a whole thing. Does that make sense? We're going to be talking about mass movements later, but let me give an example. If you have, regular food consumption, like you have breakfast, you have, what is that? Lunch, and you have dinner. If you get decently sized dinner, you probably have a bowel movement shortly after. The reason? Food reaches the stomach, signal reaches the bowels, bowels move, moving the content towards the rectum. There you go. It's not a bowel movement by itself, but it essentially promotes the bowel movement at a certain point. Does that make sense? This is why, after a meal, there is an urge for defecation. Does that make sense? So that's role for gastrin. Gastrin that is produced in the stomach. And if you look at this, which part produces it? It's pyloric antrum. Pyloric antrum, as you remember, is the part of the stomach that is fairly close pyloric antrum is fairly close to the pyloric sphincter, fairly close to the duodenum. So that's the part, oh, the food is already partially digested. We should start freeing up space downstream. Does that make sense? Ghrelin. We talked about them, hormones. When you don't have anything in the stomach, essentially, when you're fasting. Okay? Stomach produces ghrelin. Ghrelin acts on the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus gives you the feeling of hunger. Does that make sense? Histamine. This is the hormone that is produced in the stomach and acts on the stomach. Histamine specifically acts on the parietal cells, and parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid. Is that good? What is Benadryl? Antihistamine. What is the common side effect of overdose? Not horrible overdose, in addition to drowsiness and sleepiness. Constipation, yes. It's not on top the side effect lists. The first one is, of course, sleepiness and drowsiness. But constipation is in top 5. Does that make sense? Because if your stomach does not produce significant amount of hydrochloric acid, then digestion will be slowed down, and that's constipation. Does that make sense? Serotonin leads to the smooth muscle contraction. Just, and if you would look at these ones, that makes perfect sense, because the stimulus for those hormones, except for ghrelin, of course, the stimulus for histamine, for serotonin, for gastrin, is the presence of food in the stomach. Does that make sense? And you see that presence of food in the stomach, it increases the digestive activity in the stomach. Does that make sense? Now, quite interesting that there's another hormone called somatostatin. which is produced in response to the same stimulus, presence of food in the stomach. But somatostatin is produced by pyloric antrum and duodenum. So if you would look at the layout of the digestive system, it means that it's produced at the exit from the stomach and here, the first and most important part of the small intestine. And what somatostatin does, anyone remembers another name for somatostatin? Growth hormone, inhibiting hormone. Yes, that's GHIH. Okay. It essentially does exactly the opposite that you would expect. It restricts all digestive activities in the stomach. Decreases gastric motility, decreases gastric secretion, reduces even intestinal activities. Okay? You might ask, well, why? Okay, let's try to imagine what happens during the digestion. You ate a good meal. It's a good volume. That makes sense? So, say it's a volume of a quart, whatever, quart. You have a quart of food in your stomach. If only gastrin and histamine and serotonin are produced, then this quart would be churned out incredibly fast and will enter the duodenum, which is fairly small, about this size, in a massive amount. And there would be no way that nutrients from the duodenum, nutrients from that food, would be absorbed in the duodenum. So essentially, your digestive system has to keep a very fine balance between stimulating the digestion and restricting the amount of the amount of food that enters the duodenum. So think about this. When food that's in your stomach reaches antrum or duodenum, so when it's either leaving the stomach or enters the duodenum, somatostatin immediately doesn't shut down, but restricts, slows down the stomach. Sort of, okay, we've got this portion, now wait. We need to deal with whatever we have in the duodenum now, before the next portion of semi-digested food from the stomach can enter duodenum for absorption. Does that make sense? Okay? And that's a very important thing. We'll talk about it. Pretty much the idea is to let only small portion of semi-digested food to enter duodenum so it has ample time to be completely digested and to be absorbed. Does that make sense? So you don't want it to just flush through the system. Is that clear? Can we understand the stimuli and the general effects on the digestive system of these 5 hormones? Okay. Again, that's going to be, I promise, the questions and the answers are going to be very distinctive. Okay? I will do a better job than I did last time on the adrenal gland. Okay, so we're going to talk about chemical digestion now. And first, I'm going to get the enzymatic component out of my way. So this is the enzymatic component of gastric juice. There are two main enzymes found in the gastric juice, pepsin and gastric lipase. So pepsin and gastric lipase are both produced by the chief cells. Okay. Pepsin, in fact, is produced as pepsinogen. Pepsinogen, as we saw before, is activated by hydrochloric acid or pepsin itself to become a functional enzyme. So far, you follow? And the function of pepsin is to break down proteins into shorter peptides. Are we good? Gastric lipase breaks down triglycerides, fats, which refers usually to the animal fat, solid fat, and oils, liquid fat, the plant fat. And it breaks them down to monoglycerides and fatty acids. And these components then, these semi-digested molecules then will enter the duodenum for the further digestion. Does that make sense? Now, can you remind me which two biological macromolecules were digested in the mouth by saliva? Carbs and lipids. Stomach, proteins and lipids. Okay, and intestine is going to be all three of them. Okay. So far so good? Now, chemical digestion by the means of hydrochloric acid. That is a fundamental concept, fundamental chemical concept that we're going to learn. First, let's figure out the regulation. Regulation can be nervous or endocrine. Okay. You have your G cells. G cells can respond to the presence of amino acids in the stomach. Read presence of food. Or they can be stimulated by the vagus nerve. That can also respond to the presence of food in the stomach. Does that make sense? Say food enters the stomach, what happens to the shape? Stretches. That stretch is sensed by mechanoreceptors. Okay? That signal goes into the medulla. Medulla produces the response, which is stimulation of the G cells. And G cells produce gastrin. Now, gastrin enters the circulation, has wide effects, but specific effects on the stomach are partially mediated by ECL, so-called enterochromaffin-like cells. I'm not going to ask you, what is the exact function of, or spell me enterochromaffin-like cells. The point here to tell you that we have a chain of events. We have gastrin that stimulates histamine, that stimulates hydrochloric acid release. Does that make sense? That chain of events. So we have either chemoreceptors or mechanoreceptors that will sense the presence of food in the stomach, and either directly, chemoreceptors, or via the reflex, by vagus nerve, will stimulate the release of gastrin from G cells. That gastrin from G cells will stimulate ECL cells to release histamine. Histamine will stimulate parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid. That was the easy part. Now, chemistry. And so the chemical process that I'm going to describe, you're going to see it further down the road in other, on other occasions. Renal system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, digestive system. This is the fundamental way to make acid. We have an acidic compound that circulates through as a component of a blood all the time. Carbon dioxide. It's acidic. Since carbon dioxide is a gas, it's present in practically all tissues. Does that make sense? So it freely diffuses back and forth across the membrane, and of course, CO2 is going to end up in the parietal cell. We good so far? Okay. If you combine CO2 and water, well, first of all, you get carbonated water. But in the cell, chemically, if you combine CO2 and water, you produce the compound called carbonic acid. The enzyme called carbonic anhydrase facilitates the formation of carbonic acid. As practically any acid, carbonic acid can dissociate. It's really, really weak acid, which is good. We don't want any strong acid in the cells. It's a weak acid, but it's enough to produce protons and bicarbonate in ion. Can you see those? So that's a proton right here. It's a proton or hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Now, since we are talking about parietal cells of the stomach, which ion is of a greater importance for us? Hydrogen ion. So, what do we do with bicarbonate? Well, I mean, we need to get it to the blood first. We'll get to renal later. The point is, yeah, we need to get it to the blood. And is there bicarbonate in the blood? Shitload of it. In fact, bicarbonate ion in the blood comprises the main buffer system of a blood. It's really important to have it there, so that bicarbonate gets in the blood and finds its role there. Does that make sense? It is actually pumped via secondary active transport, chloride, bicarbonate, and antiporter. Okay? Bicarbonate goes one way, chloride goes another. That's why antiporter. Good? Hydrogen. We need to get it into the stomach, correct? In the lumen, from the parietal cells. This is lumen. Is there hydrogen in lumen already? Hydrogen ions. What's in the lumen? Which chemical? Hydrochloric acid. So formula for hydrochloric acid is HCl. And it dissociates. Normally, it's dissociated hydrogen ions and chloride ions, right? So, is there hydrogen in the lumen? Yes. Is there a lot? There's an enormous amount. Let me put this in the perspective. The level of concentration of so there's a pump right here called hydrogen potassium ATPase. ATPase because it breaks down ATP to pump hydrogen, one side. Does that make sense? This pump right here, this one, it can concentrate hydrogen 10,000 times. It pumps from the cell with a pH of 7.4 to the lumen with a pH of 3. Like more than 10,000 times, which is incredible, really. Okay? And at the same time, it pumps the potassium in. Potassium then diffuses back in the stomach. Okay? Sort of a side note, it's good to kind of keep it in the back burner, but it will lodge in your brain. Transmembrane, so transport of hydrogen and potassium across the membrane, they always opposite. So like if somebody loses potassium like during like aldosterone, hydrogen has to be kept in. Just the way it works. Does that make sense? Now, this chemical process, do you get it? I will ask about it. So again, carbon dioxide comes from the blood into cell. What does it combine with in the cell? Water. What is produced as the result of this combination? Carbonic acid. You need the enzyme to do it. Because, I mean, it's going to be produced without the enzyme, but enzyme makes it really fast. What happens to carbonic acid? Dissociates to, carbonic acid dissociates to bicarb and hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ion goes into the lumen of the stomach. Bicarbonate goes into the blood. And I mean, chloride, yeah. Chloride is okay, but it's not essential that much. Mechanical digestion. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. It's pretty basic. Pyloric valve is closed. When chem, that's the name, you know, when food stays in the stomach for extended period of time, it doesn't look like food anymore. Does that make sense? This is called chem. Okay? So when that chem approaches pyloric antrum and pyloric canal, that distension in pyloric antrum and pyloric canal opens up pyloric valve. This is reflex, essentially, local reflex. Does that make sense? Distension is the sensory stimulus, and then response is the opening of pyloric valve. Once the food, well, chem, not a food, chem, enters duodenum, after a small portion, in response to the signal from duodenum now, pyloric valve closes. So at a given moment, only about 3 milliliters of chem enter duodenum. Does that make sense? And then, you know, there's going to be another portion and another portion. But whatever is left is moved back, okay, to the body and the fundus for more digestion. And then it returns and moves back. And then it returns and moves back. And with every return, 3 mils enter the duodenum. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to wrap it up now. Let me stop the recording.